Hey y'all, this is Stephen Roselle, Senior Technical Specialist with Autodesk, and this is going to be part 3 of a demo series that I'm doing around Arnold in Maya, again from the perspective of somebody who maybe has been using Maya for a while but is new, kind of just learning Arnold. So let's go over the render view. So in the first presentation we covered lighting, the second one we covered shaders. If you haven't seen those, check out the YouTube channel and catch up. Otherwise, this is going to be focused on the render view itself and the cool things that you can do with the Arnold render view. So for starters, if you go into the Arnold menu and open up the render view, you get a window like this. And previously, in older versions, this was actually a separate window. It was not part of the regular Maya UI, which was a little annoying. But now you can actually just dock this right in the Maya UI, just like everything else. Now, by default, it's not going to be rendering in here until I click one of these two buttons. These two buttons are, one is to actually generate a render. So the one with a little kind of radial arrow there will just render the scene, but it doesn't have any connection to the live scene. In other words, it's just going to keep rendering what was there previously. It's doing what's called a progressive refinement. So what you'll notice is in some areas it's nice and clean, in other areas it's kind of pixely and noisy. That basically means that those areas have not actually been refined yet. Now, again, this is not updating by default. If I click on this little arrow, that's going to turn on IPR, which is interactive rendering, basically. So what that means is it's going to progressively refine the image based on scene changes until you explicitly tell it to stop. So now I can start to manipulate the camera, or I can start to manipulate things like materials on my object, and then those are automatically going to update kind of on the fly as I work with these. Let's undo that. So again, this is progressively refining the image. Now, one thing to point out as well, as you're working with the image, you may want to kind of manipulate the image. Use your standard camera controls, control middle mouse, control right mouse will track and dolly. If I want to focus in on a certain area, you can kind of pull in and see that area, but it's still rendering everything else. So what you can also do is you can kind of localize that effect using this crop region tool. So the crop region tool will basically allow you to drag a bounding box around a given area. And now that bounding box will only update based on what's in the particular region. Now I can drag this around, so if I want to look, at the wheel here, I can kind of focus in on that and let it progressively refine just that without the overhead of rendering the entire image. Now, I want to point out that I'm using fairly low quality settings here just for the sake of the demo. I am going to go into quality settings in another demonstration, but we're not going to get into that right now. So if I turn off the crop region tool, now it will start to render and progressively refine everything else. As you're kind of moving around your image and zooming in and zooming out, you might want to reset it. So there's the 1-to-1 button, which will basically set it to the real resolution size. So right now, if I take a look at the render press, I'm rendering out in HD 1080, so 1920 by 1080. Standard HD resolution. You can also set that to a kind of a percentage of that. So if we go under View here, there's a test resolution option. I'm actually rendering out 50%. If I set this to 100%, and now I click 1-to-1, that's going to actually scale the image to the actual real world size. So I'm not, because of the screen space here, I'm not actually able to see this entire image unless I kind of pull out a little bit. But oftentimes, you don't want necessarily, when you're testing and, making changes and iterating, you don't necessarily want to deal with the full resolution. So you'll switch your test resolution down to something like 50%. And then once again, click 1-to-1, and then that will just kind of set it to the actual, 50% resolution of HD in this case. Now, a few other things to point out while that's progressively refining. You can actually come in here and you can turn on what's called 3D manipulation. That is off by default. If I turn that on, now I lose my panning and my zooming abilities. And when I click in my render view, now that's actually tied to the underlying camera. So what you can do in this situation is kind of maximize your render view. And I can work directly in the render view almost as though it's a viewport. So let's say I wanted to change the tinting on the windows. I can actually click on the pixel of the window, and that will select the associated material or shader, and then I can go in and let's say I wanted to add, some kind of a, yellow tint or something like that. I can just make a change there, and then while I'm doing that, I can start to orbit the camera and almost treat this like a fancy viewport. So that obviously doesn't look very good. You oftentimes want to go back and forth with 3D manipulation. Right now that's in the menu, so it's kind of tucked away in here. But almost everything, not everything, but a lot of things have an icon associated with them. So for instance, if you go to Window, under Toolbars, there are several things that are not on by default. So one of those things is 3D manipulation. So when I do that, that will turn 3D manipulation on as an icon. So now I can kind of manipulate my image in a 2D method. And then if I click on that, now I can go back into 3D manipulation mode, and I can orbit my camera, indirectly, basically. So other things that we could do in here under toolbar icons, there's quite a few things that are turned off by default. And honestly, I'm not quite sure why that is, because a lot of this stuff you actually want. Like there's an exposure setting and a gamma setting in here that can be handy for just doing things like brightening up your image. So I've got an exposure setting here on the left. I've got a gamma setting here on the right. Those correspond also to the same controls that you have in the viewport. So if you set your gamma or exposure in the viewport, you can match that with the render view. And then if you just click on the button itself, it will just reset those to the default values, which are 0 and 1. Now we also have under toolbar icons this cool Show Debug Shading. Show Debug Shading gives you a really cool pull down that gives you just some basic kind of filters on what you're showing in your render. So by default, it's going to show you the full beauty pass, essentially, of your image. If you want to kind of isolate specific things, you can actually go in here and say, well, I want to see a basic shading without any color information, without any texture information, no shadows. If I want to just see the lighting, where I want to see shadows and I want to see the light effect on my objects, I can do that, and it'll basically turn off all the color and all the texture information. I can go into an occlusion mode, and that will give me kind of an ambient occlusion render without, actually any shading, just showing me kind of the darkness and lightness based on cracks and crevices and cavities and whatnot. I can switch over into a wireframe render, if I happen to be rendering out wireframe. There's a normal mode, there's a UV mode where I can actually see UV representation. I've got an ID mode, which I don't even know how you use that, to be honest with you, but it's in there. And there's an object mode where you can actually get different colors for every object, which is kind of cool way of breaking down your scene. And at any rate, there's a number of other modes in there, and that is not visible in the menu by default. That's one of those that you may not want in the menu. So, I like exposure and gamma being in there, but, debug shading, you may or may not want it to clutter up your UI. So a few other things to talk about. We, of course, have our simple triggers in here where I can basically disable color. I can see just the red channel. I can see the green channel. I can see the blue channel. I can see the alpha, and then I can just toggle through or cycle through and get back to the full color representation. I've got a mask which shows me the mask based on the objects that I'm seeing. So for instance, if I were to go in here and hide the background, I'm just using H to hide that. Now when I turn on my mask, it's gonna ignore the background because it's not being rendered. But now I can see what my mask looks like just with that button. So let's undo that real quick. Now there's another cool mode in here called Isolate Select. So what I did there is I hid the background just using regular Maya hide and show. But you can also set this into an Isolate Select mode, which is really cool. If I set that to Isolate Select, I can click on my object, and it will isolate that object in the render. So now I can see just what the body looks like all by itself. Or maybe I want to see what the body looks like with the ground. I can shift select the ground, and then now I can actually come in here and I can see it'll be a faster render because it's not rendering everything in my scene. It's only rendering the body, and it's only rendering the ground in this case. But that's the Isolate Select button, again, which is right here. So one more thing I forgot to show, which is actually really cool, with the Isolate Select mode. The Isolate Select mode not only works with geometry, but it also works with shading networks. So for instance, let's just turn it off, and let me go into the Hypershade. And what we'll do is we'll just graph the shading network for the ground. And actually, let me put this over to the side. just so I have a little bit more room to work with. I've got my shading network here, and I've got a bump map on the ground that I put just to add a little bit of kind of a ripple in the ground. It's a little bit hard to see in the image, so if I wanted to tweak the bump map, I can go in and I can obviously make changes to things like the bump node or things like the procedural noise node that I'm using. It's a little hard to see what's going on though, so what I can do is I can go into this isolate select mode, and let's actually just isolate just the ground here. So I'll get the ground node there, and then right now it's going to isolate the ground itself. It's a little hard to see there, but I've isolated the ground. The car is not visible. If I select the simplex noise, and as I kind of frame in on this, any changes that I make are going to be represented only for that particular node. So for instance, if I were to go in and tweak the scale, I can actually see what that scale looks like in the viewport, but I can also see what that scale looks like in the image. So if I change things like the amplitude, or if I change things like the ratio, I get an actual kind of software render representation, frequency and whatnot of what that looks like. And then if I deselect that and I just go back into my regular render view and load that up, now it's going to actually show me what the end result looks like. So let's turn off isolate select, and I can see it in the context of the actual full render. So anytime you're dealing with shading networks, it's a nice way of just isolating or kind of localizing a particular part of the shading network so you can see exactly what's going on. So this is the first part of the render view overview. I am going to cover some more advanced topics around the render view in a second movie, so be sure to check that out. Thanks. Bye.